Nicola Sturgeon is planning a campaign to persuade Scots of the advantages of immigration. The First Minister told BBC Scotland that freedom of movement across the EU after Brexit was vital to protect the Scottish economy. Ms Sturgeon was speaking to our political editor, Brian Taylor.
Nicola Sturgeon would rather stay in the European Union, but her government is working on a new document looking at options, including remaining in the European single market after Brexit. EU leaders say that's impossible unless freedom of movement for people is maintained. The First Minister acknowledges that and says she's ready to confront Scottish concerns over immigration.
Politicians have a duty to be honest with people. Freedom of movement, the ability of us in Scotland to attract talent from other countries is essential, not just to our reputation as an open, welcoming country, but essential to our economic prosperity in the years ahead.
But right now there is concern about that, there is anxiety about that. You need to get over that, don't you?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think it's incumbent on politicians not to sort of shy away from those arguments, but instead to pay them the respect they deserve, but to level with people about why freedom of movement is important. Now, let me put it in
why immigration is important.
Why immigration is important. If we see a real constraint on freedom of movement in the years ahead, the real danger is that Scotland's working age population will start to decline again at a time when our population overall is ageing. Now, the stark reality of that is that is fewer people working in our economy. There's a report out today on business confidence. Businesses will already talk about the concerns they have about the ability to recruit skilled labour, but it will also mean we've got fewer taxpayers in future paying the taxes that support our National Health Service and our other public services. So this is an issue of national self-interest.
Brexit's huge, but so's the day job, including the NHS.
Ambulance service, can you confirm the telephone?
Visiting an ambulance call centre, Nicola Sturgeon insisted there had been winter planning and extra money, but she cited exceptional pressure from flu and severe weather.
That means that there will be some patients who've waited longer than they should have done for treatment over that period, and as I will always do, apologise unreservedly to any patient in that position. But I want, most importantly of all, to take this opportunity to thank the NHS staff who've been working so hard.
And independence? Nicola Sturgeon says she will only make up her mind about whether to hold a second Scottish referendum when the Brexit terms are clearer, perhaps by October.
It would make no logical sense for me to say that I'm going to assess the situation when we've got more clarity, but then immediately to start to preempt that decision by sort of being tempted down the road that you're trying to take me. Do I believe Scotland's going to become an independent country? Well within my lifetime, sooner rather than later, yes I do.
A decision then on hold, as with so much where Brexit is concerned.
Brian is here. Brian, why do you think the First Minister is reluctant to be more firm on a second independence referendum?
It's a question of confidence, Jackie. Unlike nationalist movements elsewhere, the SNP offer in Scotland has always been not flight, but confidence. That Scotland should have the confidence to take charge of her own affairs. Brexit perhaps gives the motivation for holding a second referendum, although some would dispute that. But it then engenders in itself a lack of confidence. Whatever the outcome is, and it could be good, it could be bad, right now there is concern, there is anxiety, there is fretfulness. If you're to add an independence offer on top of that existing fretfulness, then Nicola Sturgeon's calculation is that isn't particularly good timing. That's why she needs to see the nature of Brexit first before she decides if, and it is if, there should be a second referendum. There's a second question, of course. It's not in Nicola Sturgeon's gift to hold a referendum. This would be a decision for the UK government because the Constitution is reserved to Westminster. And even amid the upheaval of a reshuffle today, the UK government through Downing Street managed to say, on the question of a second Scottish referendum, no dice.
The Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson has told BBC Scotland she doesn't want to face another referendum in her lifetime. In particular, she says the SNP should rule out any talk of a second referendum on Scottish independence. She was speaking in the third of our leader interviews this week to our political editor, Brian Taylor.
Referendums. Ruth Davidson was on the losing side over Brexit, but the winning side in the independence ballot. She doesn't fancy repeating either. In particular, she doesn't accept the SNP argument that Brexit could justify another independence referendum because Scotland voted to stay in the EU.
I believed Possibly that was my own folly, but I believed the SNP when they said that it was a once-in-a-generation decision. That's what they promised the people of Scotland, and it was a pretty clear result. We've seen in events since that 10 points is actually quite a healthy margin.
And they should stick to that promise, in your view?
Well, it was a promise that they made to people when they were looking for their votes, and they shouldn't go back in it after.
Which would mean a referendum should not take place for at least 20, 25 years.
I would quite like to be out of politics completely by the time, if there ever is another one. In fact, I would never like another one at all. I've fought 2 referendums on the Constitution, one on Brexit and one on independence, and I think they divide countries and they divide people into tribes, these binary referendums, and I would be happy never to see another one in my lifetime.
Ruth Davidson repeatedly declined to say whether Downing Street would veto a further independence referendum using Westminster powers over the Constitution. Still, with Brexit, she's meeting the Prime Minister on Monday in an effort to broker a deal over the transfer of EU-devolved powers like agriculture. Turning to income tax, she says people in Scotland shouldn't pay more than in England and perhaps in future could pay less. And she cites an unexpected mentor.
And you know, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but the person that used to best understand this was Alex Salmond. He was the person that used to talk about cutting corporation tax. He was the person that used to talk about cutting air passenger duty. And it wasn't because he wanted cheaper flights. It's because he wanted, as First Minister, more money to spend on public services, because he knew, as I do, that encouraging the growth in the business side of Scotland is how you bring in more money to this country.
Would you ultimately therefore like to offer in Scotland a lower tax rate than that applying elsewhere in the UK?
I think the long-term aim should be to do that, but right now, let's try and grow our economy.
In response, Alex Salmond stresses he channelled the SNP towards progressive income tax while leader and firmly backs that approach now. The SNP also say Tory MSPs regularly urge more spending in areas like roads and health. But Ruth Davidson says, as First Minister, she'd trim waste, cut unwanted plans like named persons and boost economic growth. Brian Taylor, reporting Scotland.